Wow, this is a teaching today. It's controversial. It's debated. It can get people hot under the collar when you present a view without the grace and kindness and gentleness of the Spirit. You present what you think is true, and it goes against the grain of what others think is true and believe to be true. And so we want to be faithful to His Word today and present this teaching as gracefully as I possibly can and as gently as I possibly can. And I pray that the things that I present, because I want to present a scriptural point of view and not just our interpretations, which can be faulty. Because our interpretations can be altered by our own preferences, our own background, what somebody has taught us in the past, what's easy. But we know that the way that the Father has led us into is a narrow road. The narrow road, and the Messiah said it's tribulated, it's difficult. And so, while that's not easy, I can't think of another word. The difficult road is not easy. But we want to walk it because we want to please the Father. We want to do what's right. So today we're going to talk about instructions for the family in Ephesians 5, the structure for unity and diversity in the family. When I first began this teaching on the inheritance of the saints, my desire was to talk about Abraham. But then as soon as you get into the account of Abraham, you're talking about the promises, the promise of blessing, the promise of seed, the promise of inheritance. And that led us naturally into looking at Paul's interpretation from the book of Ephesians. And so we went through chapter 1 and we saw the overall arching point of view that the plan of Elohim from the beginning was to bring everything back together under one head, even the Messiah. And then chapter 2 developed that further in chapter 3, and we saw that the saints, those who come into agreement that Yahushua is the Messiah and that the atonement has been accomplished through His work on the tree, His death, and then His resurrection from the grave. And so we saw that that's Paul's interpretation of the promises made to Abraham. It kind of comes to a full head in chapter 4. And I decided after we kind of finished up chapter 3, well, let's look at chapter 4 because it summarizes it. And we've talked about this for the last several weeks, where he says there's one body, there's one Spirit, there's one Elohim, there's one hope of your calling, there's one baptism. And so then that naturally led us into looking at the unity in the body, as Paul talks about the unity and the diversity. The unity in that we're all working together. Diversity is that we all have a part in that, and often those parts that each of us have are different. So the Spirit was sent in order to give us the gifts so that we can accomplish the full work of ministry, so that everyone can be brought into alignment with the Word of Elohim and into relationship and into maturity with Elohim through the Messiah. Well, I couldn't stop there because that brought us through most of chapter 4. And so I decided, well, let's just keep going on in the book of Ephesians. And so we looked last week at the what was it that we looked at? The children of light theme, that we were called out of darkness into His marvelous light. And we saw that the teaching of circumcision in the Torah is exactly that very thing. It's talking about cutting off the hardness of our hearts and coming out of the darkness into His light and receiving the things that He has given to us in order to walk uprightly before Him. And so with the children of light theme, we understand that we can't dabble in the works of darkness anymore. And we will have nothing to do with those things. We don't want to give the devil a foothold. And so I urged us all to have nothing to do with Halloween or to any other practice or so-called celebration that gives glory to darkness in any fashion, in any manner. And so I know that a lot of believers want to turn something that's darkness into something that's for the glory of Elohim. But he never called us to do that. He doesn't call us to work through the works of darkness in order to glorify him. He has called us to a different place. He has called us into the light and to do the works of the light. And those include the good works of loving him and keeping his commandments, loving one another and exercising our gifts so that we can build one another up. Amen. And so that leads into what we're looking at today, Ephesians chapter 5, instructions for the family. And so before we get into the details of that, I'm going to read this passage, and I'm going to read it out of the Scriptures version, which is published by the Institute of Scripture Research out of South Africa. It's a kind of a messianic-friendly version, and this version has some Hebrew terminology, especially the Father's name and the Son's name in the Hebrew. And so, however you pronounce those things, and I've suggested how I believe that we should be pronouncing the Father's name and the Son's name. But even like in the songs we sang today, there were different names for the Son's name. There was Yahshua, there was Yeshua, there was Yahusha, there was Jesus. And so like we were all singing different things. But that's okay. We were talking about the Son.
He knew who we were talking to.
He did. He knew who we were talking about. Hallelujah. So, the book of Ephesians. And I'm going to pick up at verse 18. Verse 21 is where we start today's study, but verse 18, just to have a flow. Do not be drunk with wine, in which is loose behavior, but be filled with the Spirit, speaking to each other in psalms and songs of praise and spiritual songs, singing and striking the strings in your heart to the Master, giving thanks always for all to Elohim the Father, in the name of our Master, Yahushua Messiah. And then verse 21, subjecting yourselves to each other in the fear of Elohim. Wives, subject yourselves to your own husbands as to the Master, because the husband is head of the wife, as also the Messiah is head of the assembly, and he is Savior of the body. But as the assembly is subject to Messiah, so also let the wives be to their own husbands in every respect. Husbands, love your wives, as Messiah also did love the assembly, and gave himself for it, in order to set it apart and cleanse it with the washing of water by the word, in order to present it to himself a splendid assembly, not having spot or wrinkle or any of this sort, but that it might be set apart and blameless. In this way, husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. For he who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but feeds and cherishes it, as also the Master does the assembly. Because we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. For this cause a man shall leave his father and mother, and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This secret or mystery is great, but I speak concerning Messiah and the assembly. However, you too, everyone, let each one love his own wife as himself, and let the wife see that she fears or reverences her husband. Children, obey your parents in the Master, for this is right. Respect your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, in order that it might be well with you, and you might live long on the earth. And you, fathers, do not provoke your children, but bring them up in the instruction and admonition of the Master. Servants, obey your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart, as to Messiah. Not with eye service as men pleasers, but as servants of Messiah, doing the desire of Elohim from the inner self, rendering service with pleasure as to the Master, and not to men, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he shall receive the same from the master, whether he is a slave or free. And masters, do the same to them. Refrain from threatening, knowing that your own master also is in the heavens, and there is no partiality with him. And that's the end of the section that we're going to be looking at today. The teaching in Ephesians 4 about the unity and diversity of the body naturally leads, we talked about that body metaphor, and Paul uses it in several places in his writings. That body metaphor transfers in this section to looking at the family as a body, kind of a subset of the full body of Messiah, so that each family is a part of the larger body, and the rules for the larger body carry down to the rules for the family in some sense, and we're going to look at exactly how that comes down and translates into the body, the family body. So, starting with Ephesians 5:21, it says, "Submit to one another out of reverence for Messiah." That's the New International Version translation. Submit to one another out of reverence for Messiah. The King James Version reads this way: "Submitting yourselves one to another in the fear of God." A little bit different, but what we want to do is try to come to answer this question: who should submit to whom? In other words, this idea of submission, what does this mean in the family? Because in the body of Messiah, it's fairly clear that we all submit to Messiah, right? I mean, he's the head, and he's the one that we all submit to and listen to, because he's the prophet that was sent, that Moshe talked about. The prophet who would come, he was going to be a prophet like Moshe, and that so that in this way he would be like Moshe, that he would hear from the Father and he would teach according to what the Father had said. And so everyone was going to be responsible for answering to how they either obeyed or did not obey that prophet that was to come. Messiah is that prophet, and so we submit to him because we know that he's going to be the judge at judgment time. He didn't come previously to judge the world, but that the world through him might be saved. But he is coming back as judge, and so we're going to have to answer to him and give a reckoning for our lives. So this idea of submission. Let me look at this word. In the Greek, it's hupotasso. It means to arrange under, to subordinate, to subject or put in subjection, to often translated obey or be under the authority of, also means a subordinate place. And so submission simply means, I mean, it's kind of obvious. It means being under the authority of someone else in a way that you have to answer to that person. Also in verse 21, Ephesians 5, there's the word allelois. It means one another, or reciprocal, mutually, one to another and to one another. And I'm going to explain what that means, why that's important in just a minute. So you see the Greek word allelois is usually translated to one another or one to another. And reciprocally, I want to go back to these two versions of verse 21 that I just read. The New International Version interprets this word reciprocally, meaning one to another, back and forth. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So each one submits to the other in some sense in Christ. The King James Version translated this in a way that is not reciprocal. Submitting yourselves one to another in the fear of God. One to another is very different. This one submitting to this one is very different than each submitting to each other. And so we have to come to understand, what's Paul really saying here? And I think the next couple of slides are going to very clearly explain how he is using this word. Is it reciprocal or is it not reciprocal? The logic of the text of Ephesians 5, beginning at verse 21, is as follows. It says, submit to one another out of reverence for Messiah. And then Paul breaks it down into sections, and he explains what he means by submitting. Is it reciprocal or is it one to another? And so Paul says, wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. So here's an instance where the submitting that he's describing here in verse 21 is laid out for us. The logic of it. He says, for the husband is the head of the wife, as Messiah is the head of the assembly, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the assembly submits to Messiah, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. He does not follow up with anything about husbands submitting to their wives, because that's not what he's talking about. There's a structure in place, which he has just described in these verses, that the husband is the head of the wife, and therefore, this is the reason why the wives are supposed to submit to their husbands. But husbands are not required, let me put it that way, to submit to their wives. I think a husband ought very well, if he's a wise husband, he's going to listen to his wife, because Elohim has put in his wife gifts that he doesn't have, and insights and wisdom that he doesn't have. And the wife as helper, we're going to talk about this as well in more detail, the wife as the man's helper brings him things maybe that he didn't think of or that he didn't consider, or gifts that he himself doesn't have. And so the wife is a helper in the sense that she completes him. She fills in the gaps for the man. And so, but the husband is the head of the wife, meaning that there's a structure that Elohim has established in order that the family can be a unity and still be a diversity at the same time. Each of the members of the family having their specific gifts that contribute to the wellness of the family and to the unity of the family. And so, how would it turn out if there were no head of the family? If the husband and the wife had equal authority, and there were, in essence, two heads to the family, what would happen if there were two heads in the family?
Clash.
There would be clashing, yes. There would be confusion. There would be dissension. There would be argument. And so this isn't the Father's plan. He established husbands to be the head of the family, just as Messiah is the head of the assembly. And so here the body metaphor that we saw earlier in the assembly carries down into the family structure. There's also this body metaphor at work, or at least the metaphor describes the various functions in the family and the roles that each member of the family play in the unity of the family. So the logic of the text continues on. He said, submit one to another. Wives, submit to your husbands. That's part of it. That's the one submitting to the other. And then children, obey your parents in Yahweh, for this is right. So the children submit to their parents. This is the structure that was established. What would it look like if parents had to submit to children? They couldn't have a reciprocal relationship in submitting to one another, because, then what? That's just craziness. That's confusion again.
Beyond crazy.
It's beyond crazy. So Paul's description of submitting one to another is not a reciprocal relationship. Slaves, obey your earthly masters. What would it look like if slaves had authority over their masters, and the masters at the same time had authority over their slaves, and no one was submitting, but everyone was just doing their own thing? That wouldn't work out too well. And so I think by the structure of these several verses, it explains very clearly what Paul meant in verse 21. It's not a reciprocal submission, but it's a submission according to a structure that Elohim has established in the family. Okay? The husband's the head, the wife is under his authority. The children are under both of their authority and have to obey both their parents. And in the family, back in those days, there were masters and slaves as well. There were other family members that were not natural born, or they were not married to the family, but were part of the household, masters and slaves. And so the slaves were subject to their masters. Their masters had authority over them. The master was often the head of the household, was the husband, but not necessarily, not always that way. In any case, the slaves were to obey and to submit themselves to the masters. He says, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Messiah. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but like slaves of Messiah, doing the will of Elohim from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving Yahweh, the Lord. So this submission is demonstrated in these various communications or relationships between members within the household. So when Paul tells us to submit to one another, this is kind of a summary statement. What he really has in mind is that we should submit to one another along the lines of the authority structures implemented by Elohim. Each of the social tiers have their own roles and responsibilities, and everyone answers or is responsible to someone above them. Slaves are accountable to their masters, children are accountable to their parents, wives are answerable to their husbands, and even men are responsible for those under their authority and are accountable to Messiah for their actions. So everyone has a place in order for the unity of the family to work well. Each one falls into this structure and into a place in that hierarchical authority structure that Elohim has established. Paul goes on to say, now I want you to realize, well, this is in 1 Corinthians 11. This is a text of support for this idea of the man being the head of the woman. Now I want you to realize that the head of every man is Messiah, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Messiah is Elohim. Everyone is under the authority of someone and is responsible in answering to that authority. So, at the end of the day, Paul most emphatically does not teach mutual submission in the body of the family within Messiah. Such a scenario would be absurd, as we discussed. If this were true, parents would have to submit to their children, masters would have to submit to their slaves. It is only if these two are true, and they're clearly not, that the husband should also be submitting to their own wives. Each of these is emphatically and explicitly excluded by the teaching of Paul in this passage. I know it's a popular teaching that we hear in a number of different congregations. And it's kind of a warm, fuzzy teaching that if we all just submit to one another, everything would be rosy, everything would work out. But as you can see, it can't work out if you got more than one head. You got, everyone submitting to everyone else. There's no structure at all in that kind of wild and crazy scenario. So I think it's, Paul's been misrepresented here in this text, and it's from a politically correct point of view that even ministers of the gospel misinterpret what Paul is saying here. Because we all want to be friendly. That's not even a good word. We want to present an image of the church, of the Assembly of Messiah, as one that is progressive and up to speed with the latest thoughts and therefore politically correct. But if we go down that path, we're not going to really be doing what the scriptures are teaching us to do. So.
Is that how the gospel eventually goes on a slippery slide downwards into false teachings?
That's certainly
just one small thing, right?
Yeah, that's one small thing, and that is part of how far we've gotten away from the true teachings of Scripture.
Yeah.
I have the point of view that Paul is a genuine apostle, as he describes himself, and that the writings are reliable. They correctly reflect the proper interpretation of the law and the prophets. And I know that not everyone has that point of view, because we've been taught over the centuries that the law's been done away with, that, there are congregations, even among the Christian assemblies, that don't even listen to what Jesus teaches, because they say, Jesus spoke to the Jews, we're Gentiles, and Paul is the one that teaches us.
Oh, right.
We call them ultra-dispensationalists, and there are people out there that teach that not even Jesus is to be obeyed. You can't take anything out of the four Gospels and try to convince them that that's what they ought to be doing, because they don't believe that Jesus was speaking to them. Okay. Yeah, it's kind of strange. But there's such a wide variety of interpretation of Scripture, even among the Christian churches, that we just have to be careful and follow it up. I've said this a million times now, that if my interpretation of Paul does not agree with the Torah and the prophets, then I've got a bad interpretation of Paul. Because if Paul is a true prophet and a true apostle, if Paul is a true prophet, then everything he teaches is going to be in agreement with the Torah and the prophets, because those are the words that proceeded out of Elohim's mouth, the Torah and the prophets. So that is the point of view that I have. And so when I look at Paul, I look at an authoritative teaching, even in this area of headship and submission. Even though it's not popular in our day to have this teaching, I'm trying to present to you, as best I can, an understanding of Paul that is in agreement with the Torah and the prophets. And I think that's the safe way to go, is to agree with what God spoke, and not what men's traditions have brought on, and over the centuries, all the changes, all the various changes that have been brought in, and doctrines of men that have been brought in, that have led us to many errors in our interpretation of the Bible. Mm-hmm. This is one of them, and I think that authority is important. And so we're gonna break into that and give some reasons in just a moment. Wives, submit to your husbands. Let me say this about, I put the word submit in parentheses, because in the Greek it says in verse 21, submitting one to another in the fear of Messiah. And then it says, wives, to your husbands. The word submit isn't actually there in verse 22. It's following the verb that's found in verse 21, the submitting verb. And so therefore, wives, to your husbands. So it's kind of the same sentence. Submitting one to another in the fear of Messiah, wives, to your husbands. And that's the pattern, the structure that Paul gives. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Messiah is the head. Now the assembly submits to Messiah, as the assembly submits to Messiah. So wives should submit, and the word submit isn't there again. It's following up on the verb at the beginning of verse 24. As the assembly submits, so wives to their husbands and everything. I just want to give you a very clear vision of what the Greek says, because many of you can't read Greek, and so you're dependent upon your teacher to tell you what the Greek says. And so I'm telling you what the Greek says. The word submit is in parentheses because it's drawn from the beginning of verse 24. That as the assembly submits, so wives should submit to their husbands. And so the body metaphor, remember, was brought up in chapter 1 of Ephesians, where it says, Elohim placed all things under his feet and appointed him to be head over everything for the assembly, which is his body, the fullness of him who fills everything in every way. And of course, it's speaking of Yahushua Messiah. He's the head. He's been appointed the head over everything for the assembly. Does it say for? For the assembly, which is his body. And so Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11, I want you to realize that the head of a man is Messiah, the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Messiah is Elohim. The headship speaks to the issues of authority and order. And so whenever we get into a discussion, or whenever these kind of discussions come up about headship and submission, the question about, is Paul's teaching on submission of wives really reliable? Is this the way Elohim has established it? And so I want to present to you why women should be submissive. In the writings of Paul, altogether, Paul rehearses these 6 distinct reasons why women should walk in submission and exercise silence in the assembly, in the congregation, and have no authority over a man. He actually gives 6 different reasons why this is true. And these are the 6 reasons. And we're going to look at the verses, but let me list the 6, and then we're going to go over those verses that describe these 6 reasons why women should be submissive. Number 1, Adam was formed first, and then Chava, or Eve. Number 2, the woman was deceived and became a sinner. Number 3, there is no practice in all the congregations of the saints, but for women to remain silent. Number 4, the Torah says that women should be submissive and silent. Number 5, it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the assembly. And number 6, what Paul is saying about the role of women is a command from the master. And that's the one that is never talked about, that it's a command from the master. And yet Paul makes his case for these 6 reasons a woman should be in submission. In 1 Timothy, another passage which talks about this submission, Paul writes to Timothy, a woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She must be silent. For, and here's number 1 of that list of 6, for Adam was formed first and then Chava. And Adam was not the one deceived, and this is the second reason. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. So these are reasons that Paul has given. And this is written in 1 Timothy. In 1 Corinthians 14, a couple more reasons are given. 1 Corinthians 14, 33 to 35, it says this, as in all the congregations of the saints, women should remain silent in the assembly. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission. And number 4 in the list of 6, as the Torah says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home for, and here's number 5, it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the assembly. Reading further in 1 Corinthians 14, Paul says, did the word of Elohim originate with you? Or are you the only people it has reached? If anybody thinks he is a prophet or spiritually gifted, let him acknowledge that. Number 6, what I am writing to you is the master's command. If he ignores this, he himself will be ignored. And so those 6 reasons are given why women need to be in submission in the family structure and in the assembly. So let's look at a couple of those claims of Paul. Woman created as man's helper. This is found in Genesis chapter 2, I believe 2. Is that 3 or 2? Somebody can look that up for me. Yahweh Elohim said, it is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him. Now listen to the backdrop of this statement. It says, now Yahweh Elohim had formed out of the ground all the beasts of the field and all the birds of the air. He brought them to the man to see what he would name them, and whatever the man called each living creature, that was its name. And so the man gave names to all the livestock, the birds of the field and the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. But for Adam, no suitable helper was found. So all the rest of the created living creatures had a suitable helper. The thrust of the passage is in the phrase, helper suitable for him. This is a fair translation of the Hebrew, ezer kenegdo. Ezer kenegdo. Ezer means a helper, support. Neged, from which kenegdo comes from, means to be conspicuous, to declare, to tell, to make known. And thus, neged usually indicates something in front of, or in the face of, in the sight of, opposite to. So this idea of kenegdo is his complement. It's the one that he is a partner with. So the man didn't have a partner, but he needed a partner. Each of the animals that Adam named had a mate, a complementary like creature with whom each of the animals could reproduce its own kind. But Adam didn't have one of those. And this helper suitable to him is clearly a reference to a mating partner. And thus the ezer kenegdo is a helper who stands in front of or in the sight of Elohim, of Adam, as his mate or partner. And the ezer kenegdo is Adam's completing part. What Adam can't do on his own, he needs this ezer kenegdo to help him accomplish what he was put on earth for, which is to reproduce the human race. As a mating partner, this helper is not Adam's equal. He did not need an equal. He needed someone to do for him what he could not do for himself and by himself. He needed a mating partner. The helper is not Adam's competition. The helper is designed to fill in the gaps for Adam. The helper is Adam's complement, his fulfilling partner, the one who, using a phrase from a popular movie, completes him. All right? She completes him. This mate can help him to help him accomplish what Adam cannot accomplish alone. Okay, I've said that several times now. I think it's, I don't mean to be so redundant, but I think it's important to see this point, that the wife is not in competition with the husband. The wife is not the same in every respect as the husband. The wife wasn't created to be the same, but the wife was created to be a helper, to fill in for the man what he cannot do for himself. And so, I wanted to say something else about this. Man and woman were created with form and function, and very distinct form and function. The form, the biology is too clear. We don't need to go into any detail about that. The different physical properties of the male and female bodies in order to accomplish something. The function goes along with the form. The function is to accomplish a certain something. And so the different forms of male and female are created in order to accomplish something by uniting the two. And so the human race can be propagated by the uniting of the two, by bringing the different forms and functions together in unity to accomplish that for which Elohim created them. And so, just to dispel the idea that man and women are equal in every sense. And when I say that they're not equal, I'm not saying a couple of things that people are going to attribute to what I just said. Both male and female were created in the image of God and are like Elohim. And both male and female have a certain role in the family and in the plan of Elohim. Those are different roles that each of them play. And so the politically correct view of, and this is brought on by another misinterpretation of Scripture where Paul says there's no male or female in Messiah. He's not talking about form and function there. He's talking about our position as children of Elohim. There's no difference between male and female. We're all made in the image of Elohim, and we all can come into the presence and into relationship with Elohim. So one doesn't have advantage of the other. We all have the same opportunity to turn away from our sin and to be joined unto Elohim and to do His will. And so in some ways there are differences. In some ways male and female are the same. And so we have to make those distinctions and not just lump it all together and say, well, Paul said there's no male or female. So we're completely equal in every aspect and in everything in the spiritual world and in the physical world. So understand that there had to be an establishment of authority, a structure whereby there is a head and then there was a partner that is in submission to that headship. The headship comes along with it responsibility and accountability to Elohim. And so I know that I've heard testimonies from women that they're glad that they're not the head because that the responsibility of making decisions for the family doesn't fall on them in the sense that they're not going to be accountable or responsible for either a right decision or a wrong decision regarding the family. So along with headship comes responsibility. The women are given an opportunity to be in submission and to fulfill their role and their responsibilities in the creation. Okay. So where does the Torah teach male headship? And I'm just going to list a couple things here real quick because we could ask the same question. Where does the Torah teach that women should be silent and in submission? And we're going to look at that as well. But here's where the Torah teaches male headship. The order of creation, as Paul pointed out. The man was created first, and then the woman. And this order of the creation is important. Just as we look at the creation of man on the sixth day and the establishment of the Sabbath on the seventh day, Yahusha said the Sabbath was not made for man, but man. Did I say that wrong?
Yeah.
I did. I said that wrong, didn't I? Man was
Sabbath was made for man.
the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Thank you. So what he's saying there is the man was created on day 6, and that establishes an order, because the Sabbath came afterwards. The Sabbath was made for man. The man was made first. He is the priority. The Sabbath was made for man. It was created after man, for the man. And so you can see the same order in the creation of man and woman. The man was created first. He went about certain activities, including naming all the animals, and then, it was like, duh, where's my partner, right? And so Elohim said, it's not good for the man to be alone. And so he created the woman out of the side of the man. And that the very order of that creation establishes a hierarchical structure in the family. That the man is the head and the woman is in submission. Because she came second, she came as a helper, and she has certain roles and responsibilities that are different than that of the man.
Okay.
Sure.
How long was the man created prior to Eve being created?
The scriptures don't really tell us. I mean, we could only guess or speculate, but he at least had time to name all the animals.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah, so I don't know how long that took him.
Yeah.
Or whatever else occurred between his being created out of the dust of the ground and then her being formed from his side. The second thing is patriarchy, which is, it's really frowned upon in politically correct circles, that historically speaking, men were always heads of their families.
Mm-hmm.
and that the whole society was based upon a headship of the man throughout really the history of mankind on the earth. So this idea of patriarchy as opposed to matriarchy. Matriarchy would be a woman who is the head of a home. Patriarchy is the father or a man being the head of the home. And so the example of patriarchy all throughout the Old Testament scriptures indicates that this is the way and the order that was established by Elohim from the beginning. Inheritance is another thing that we look at, and we realize that boys were always heirs of their father's estate, at least in the scriptures. You know, when we look at all the inheritances, they were never passed on from father to daughter. They were passed from father to son. The daughters married usually into another family and became part of that family. And so their inheritance, as it were, was to be the wife or a part of the family of the man that they married. But the inheritance of land was always passed down to the sons. And so all of the, when Joshua divvied up the land, he named off all the different families by the man's name, not by a woman's name. There was a case, though, Zelophehad's daughters, Zelophehad had no sons, and there was concern about where his inheritance would go. And so Moshe asked the father, what do we do in this case? And he said, the daughters can have control of the inheritance until they had sons, and then their sons would then take over that inheritance. So that Zelophehad, was it Zelophehad? Yeah, it was the man, right? Zelophehad would have his inheritance passed on to sons. His daughters would marry, whoever, and then that firstborn son would be the inheritor of Zelophehad's land that was given to him.
I think the daughters had to marry to the same tribe of people.
Yeah, they had to marry the same
Yeah, that's right. That stipulation was there, so that land could remain within the tribe and then be given to the sons of that marriage as sons of Zelophehad himself. They were considered that way. The genealogies also present where the Torah teaches that the men are heads. And so all the genealogies you'll see from early on in Genesis and all throughout the Old Testament history, it lists the men as heads of those households and their sons and sons after them and so forth and so on. So the genealogies were male oriented, if you will. There's also a teaching in Numbers 30, and this is where I'll end this brief synopsis of where the Torah teaches male headship. Numbers 30 describes a situation which indicates male headship over a woman. If a woman living with her husband makes a vow or obligates herself by a pledge under oath, and her husband hears about it but says nothing to her and does not forbid her, then all her vows or the pledges by which she obligated herself will stand. But if her husband nullifies them when he hears about them, then none of the vows or pledges that came from her lips will stand. Her husband has nullified them, and Yahweh will release her. Her husband may confirm or nullify any vow she makes, or any sworn pledge to deny herself. And so this indicates that the husband has authority over even what his wife speaks. He can nullify if he sees that they weren't wise, the words that she pledged herself to or brought herself under oath to, and he recognizes that he has the authority to nullify the oath that she's taken, the words that she has spoken. So this indicates the husband's authority or headship over his wife. It goes on to say this, but if her husband says nothing to her about it from day to day, and then he confirms all her vows, or the pledges binding on her. And so here he also has the authority to confirm what the wife has said. He can nullify or confirm what his wife has said. He confirms them by saying nothing to her when he hears about them. If, however, he nullifies them sometime after he hears about them, then he is responsible for her guilt. He can't beat around the bush. If he hears about something his wife spoke and disagrees with it, he has to nullify it immediately. If he lets it go on, then her words he has confirmed. And even later, if he regrets not nullifying it, he bears the responsibility of her oaths. These are the regulations Yahweh gave Moshe concerning relationships between a man and his wife, and between a father and his young daughter still living in his house. The same is said, and I'm not going to read that passage, about a young woman, unmarried, living in her father's household, that the father also has the right to nullify what his unmarried daughter, living in his house, has pledged herself to. He can nullify that as well. And so the father has authority over his daughter, the husband has authority over his wife, and can nullify the oaths that they take.
Dave,
Yes, sir.
could you give some example of what a vow or a pledge might be, and what could be nullified?
Kathy wants to answer that one.
Well, words are powerful. So last night, Dave and I were sitting in bed and we were talking, and I said something flew off my tongue, and I said, well, and this is a paraphrase, well, that'll kill you. And then I laughed because I was being funny. I realized how powerful words are and how we're praying for Dave's healing. And I not only said, I take that back, I do not want those words to stand. Dave also said it. He said, I nullify those words also. So, in just our words, take every thought captive.
Yeah.
So that was one little
That's
example
good.
just last
Very
night
good.
that happened to us.
It could be anything that the wife speaks, either like flippantly off the tip of her tongue, even jokingly. But because words are powerful, and when you speak, you are in a sense taking an oath. Then foolish talk. We shouldn't, like we read in Paul last week in Ephesians, there should be no foolish talk or coarse jesting and those kind of things. So the things that fly off of our tongues when we're not guarding our speech can get us into trouble. And when a woman speaks things that shouldn't be spoken and the husband hears it and catches it, he can nullify it because we know the trouble that it can get all of us into when words are left out there. Yes, sir.
So, turn it around, and if the husband would say something flippant, negative, the wife could advise, and he could, and then they both could nullify, right? Or could the husband himself repent, maybe, or?
I think it's the husband's responsibility to repent. If he realizes something he said, or if his wife says, hey, listen to what you just said, then he can reverse that and repent of it. If he doesn't, if he just lets that word fly out there, then he's responsible for the end course of, whatever that brings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, David.
Yes, sir.
So what does it mean when he said, if however he nullifies them sometime after he hears about them, that he was responsible? I mean, he is responsible for her guilt.
Yeah.
So what is her guilt? Just for making the vow, or for not keeping the vow, or?
Yeah, it could be either. I mean, if it's a foolish vow, or if she speaks something and then doesn't fulfill it, then because he is her head and he is responsible for her, then he bears the responsibility of her guilt if there's guilt involved in what she said. So he has to take that upon himself. If he heard the word she spoke and then didn't do anything about it, but maybe later on the situation brought them to a place where he realized that she shouldn't have said that. It gets them into trouble or into some transgression. And then he tries to nullify it, it's too late. He has to nullify it when he hears it. He can't wait a period of time.
Yeah.
And only when it's convenient to say, oh, no, she shouldn't have said that, I take it back. It doesn't work that way. He bears the guilt.
I have a question about what a vow is. Here's the microphone. Okay, I have is a vow when you say you're going to do something and then either you do it or you don't do it? Or is a vow speaking a negative word and then seeing it be fulfilled and manifest? Or could it be both?
It could be both. A vow is, or an oath is anything that a person speaks. Typically, vows in a court of law
Yeah.
were taken in the name of Yahweh. And the scripture, the Torah tells us that your vows should be taken in the name of Yahweh. But any word that you speak is in some sense a vow. Because you're proclaiming something. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to interrupt you. So if you say something that you're going to do and then you don't fulfill it, then your husband would be responsible for that, for making sure that you fulfill that? I don't understand why.
No, if something that was spoken comes back to bite you,
Oh,
or it causes transgression, then the husband bears the responsibility because he didn't speak up to nullify it.
right. What about, I'm having a hard time with my words right now.
Go ahead.
Join the party.
Like if you don't follow through on your word on something, does that count?
Yeah, that would be transgression.
How would he nullify that? If you've already spoke the word that you're gonna do something, then you don't follow through on it, is it just automatically you just have to be guilty of the consequences of that? Or is there some way to rectify that?
Did you have an answer to her question?
Yeah, I have a practical example.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's grab this, although I think I'm loud enough in the world. Let's say I'm in charge of a factory, and I have factory workers, and I really try to keep an eye on them. They make decisions, they're putting out so much a day, and then one of my salesmen makes a decision, and I wasn't aware of it, that he's gonna lose money in this deal, but he signed the paperwork, I've given him the authority to sign the paperwork. Who loses? He might get fired, or I might just scold him or write him up, but basically I'm the guy at the top. I'm the one that's gonna pay the penalty that we're not making a profit. So if we think of a household like a business, then sometimes you know what your family's doing, sometimes you don't. That's why we need a really close tie with our family. That's where, Satan's idea is just to tear relationships apart. Yahweh's idea is to bring relationships together and in unison. And so we get so close to the Father and so close to each other that we wouldn't make a decision without talking to our spouse, or we wouldn't make something that would hurt anybody else without first discussing it. And I'm sure that does happen, and it's because we fall away from Him and fall away from each other, and then that's just sin in this world. But ultimately, the head of the house is always the one that has to pay the cost and take the brunt of it, even though we may suffer too if we're down below and we made a bad decision. So I'm just trying to bring it up
Yeah,
practical.
that's good.
Yeah.
And that's where this
Yeah.
teaching in Bamidbar really comes to a head. It's describing both headship and submission. The headship of the man over his wife or over his unmarried daughter living in his home. And the submission of him having the authority to nullify, and if it comes back to bite them, if it comes back to hurt the family, it's the man that bears that guilt and bears that loss or whatever, the consequence is.
And actually, one quick one, excuse me. The submission is the completion of the authority and power that God will bring to two people that are in total unity.
Mhm.
And guess who loses? Satan loses everything when that works right.
Yeah, hallelujah.
It's like you have You have general patent and you've got a private. And this private, he's doing what the general says, and he takes the bridge, and, because he's got the authority of patent to go out and, do the job. Anyway.
Yeah, if you didn't finish, maybe you can finish. I just write down the questions.
Yes.
Or do you want me to ask one now, or you prefer finish your teaching? I like to, you finish your teaching.
Yeah, if you could hold off the question, that'd be great.
So I was thinking, the problems that could, I think that's very good. I think that the wife should, talk to her husband first. But she also needs to be willing to, humble herself if she made a vow that affects the family. She promised someone, I told them we'd give them our second car, I already said I would do it or whatever, so I need that car to get to work or whatever, just an example. So, I could just see the problems that could be created with her and the people she promised. She needs to be willing to humble herself. And like this is in Proverbs, if you, it says, try to go to the person, try to get out of it or whatever if you made a promise.
And that's why it's important that the Torah gives the husband the right to nullify. Because he ultimately has to bear responsibility for her oaths and the actions she takes. So some say that Paul's antiquated teaching about silence and submission was only for the situation in Corinth. A bit of good advice, but not law. And so with some of Paul's teachings, people tried to dismiss Paul's teachings as his own opinion about a matter, although there are a couple of places where he says, this is me, not the Lord. He's saying, I'm giving my judgment in this situation. This doesn't come from the Lord. But by and large, what Paul is teaching is not situational teachings. These things are based on the Torah and what the Father has prescribed for his people. And he gave those 6 reasons why what he was saying about submission and silence is not from him. This isn't his teaching, but he's reiterating something that the Father has spoken and that is taught in the Torah and the prophets. So Paul taught Timothy to teach the same things. In other words, the 2 passages that talk about submission and silence for women, he also taught to Timothy to be able to teach. I think wasn't Timothy assigned to Ephesus? I'm thinking he was. And so this teaching went out through Timothy to Ephesus as well, and not just to Corinth. And so he's telling the Ephesians in this letter about the headship and submission properties within the family. So not only did Paul teach Timothy these things, which leaves in the dust this idea that this was only because of a situation in Corinth. Peter also tells in his letter to the 12 tribes that women should have a gentle and quiet spirit and be subject to their husbands. So subjection is a teaching not just of Paul to Corinth, because you'll have some preachers try to present it that way and try to convince you that this isn't a universal way for the body of Messiah. But Peter also teaches it, and it appears that all of the apostles did, on the basis of the fact that at least this teaching was given in 3 different situations. To the church of Corinth, to Timothy, who would teach the same thing in Ephesus, and Peter, who taught to all the 12 tribes of Israel. So here's the passage in Timothy. He says, I also want women to dress modestly, with decency and propriety, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or expensive clothes, but with good deeds, appropriate for women who profess to worship Elohim. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She must be silent. For Adam was formed first and then Chava, and Adam was not the one deceived, it was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. Peter teaches the same thing. 1 Peter 3, 1 through 6. Wives, in the same way, be submissive to your husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives, when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. Your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as braided hair or the wearing of gold, jewelry, and fine clothes. Instead, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in Elohim's sight. For this is the way holy women of the past, who put their hope in Elohim, used to make themselves beautiful. They were submissive to their own husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her master. You are her daughters if you do what is right and do not give way to fear. So again, this is the teaching of all the apostles. Their interpretation of the Old Testament is that women were quietly submissive to their husbands. I want to look at this word quiet here in 1 Peter 3, where it says a gentle and quiet spirit. I guess I'm going to look at it later. Where did I put that? Okay, let me just summarize it then, if I can find my place. Timothy, Peter, and Titus. Oh, Titus kind of says, the letter to Titus says the same thing, that the older women teach them to be reverent in the way they live, not to be slanderers or addicted to much wine, but to teach what is good. And then they can train the younger women to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled and pure, to be busy at home, to be kind, and to be subject to their husbands, so that no one will malign the word of Elohim. And so over and over again, this teaching comes forth in the New Testament. The word quiet spirit is the exact same Greek word that Paul uses, which is usually translated be silent. Okay, and that's what I wanted to point out, is that Peter teaches the same thing about women being silent. And that's here in this phrase, quiet spirit. The word quiet is the same Greek word as silent. And so, again, I'm trying to present a scripturally accurate understanding of why women should be in submission. And I guess I'm going to leave that subject there, and then after I go through the rest of these, you can ask any question you want, and I'll do my best to answer it. And so let's move on.
So David, are you
Yes.
saying move on from being quiet?
The subject of submission and silence of the wives. I want to talk about husbands too, and about the rest of the instructions given to the household.
Yes.
I mean, we could go on and talk further about this, but then this teaching is going to stretch out for another week or two, if we keep stretching it out. I'm trying to just summarize it and give the reasons why I believe what Paul was teaching is accurate, it's scriptural, it's something that we need to consider in the body of Messiah and in our families. Husbands, love your wives just as Messiah loved the assembly and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant assembly, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. And so Messiah loved the assembly in this fashion, that he desires by each of us using our gifts and working together, to be able to present us as a people, as a holy and blameless people before Elohim. And so that's the goal of Messiah, loving the assembly and giving himself up for her. Husbands are supposed to love their wives in this fashion. And I have some criticism for the husbands, because I think this role reversal and this politically correct interpretation of Scripture is largely and mostly the husband's fault that this has occurred, because husbands haven't manned up to their responsibility and their role in the husband-wife relationship. And so I believe that women, where there is a gap, where there needs to be something filled in, because the husband isn't taking responsibility, he isn't being the husband that he's supposed to be to his wife, he's not being the father that he's supposed to be to his children, that the women try to fill in the gap.
Yeah.
And so they take on responsibilities that weren't meant to be theirs, they take on roles that weren't meant to be theirs, and so now you've got this whole thing upside down, because, and again, I'm blaming the men for this, that the men have not done what the scriptures have told us to do, and that is to, regarding the commandments of Elohim, to talk about them when you rise up and when you lie down, and when you walk along the road and when you sit at home. Men haven't been doing this. Men have not been being the leader in their home, either with their wife or with their children. They've dropped the ball by and large, and this has been going on not just for months now, but for years, for decades, maybe even for centuries. And so my position is one of sympathy for the family, and not of blame or of trying to put in my own way or by my own interpretation. I'm not trying to put women in a lesser role than they were meant to be, that Elohim created them to be in. What I'm trying to do is restore order in the family structure by showing you and pointing out these teachings to you, that it's not just Paul saying these things to a select group of people, but it's what the whole Bible teaches about the structure that Elohim has created, so that the family can be a unity, so that we could be pleasing in everything we do, and that we wouldn't have all these fallouts of broken homes and misunderstood responsibilities and laziness on the part of many who will not do the things that they're instructed to do. And so the whole family suffers. So husbands, love your wives. And loving your wives doesn't mean in a physical sense. It's about caring for your wife in the same manner that Messiah cares and nurtures his assembly. We have to get back to this, men. We have to get back to viewing our wife in the same way that Messiah views his people.
Yeah.
Because when we take on this attitude of as head, I own you. You belong to me, you have to do what I say. That spirit of domination. Domination was never intended in the structure that Elohim established, either before or after sin. It was never part of Elohim's plan that man dominate over his woman. But to be head and to be an example and to be a servant, those are the things that their husbands are supposed to do. As loving their wives, the men need to be servants. I didn't.
As Messiah loved the body, yeah. I'm just
Yeah.
saying what you
Yeah, the idea here is that when the husband does the things he's supposed to do in loving his wife and honoring her and listening to her, because she has spiritual gifts too that he doesn't have. That's the whole helper, the neged kenegdo, the ezer kenegdo concept in the Hebrew of a helper suitable to him. The wife provides things that the husband doesn't have on his own. He needs that support, that help, the giftings that she brings. And so a wise man will listen to his wife. And if the advice and the counsel is good from his wife, and he recognizes it, he needs to take up on it. And so honor his wife, because a man that doesn't listen to what his wife says is going to suffer in the end himself, because he's not listening to the counsel that Elohim appointed to him as the helpmeet that Father created the woman to be.
So
Yes,
So the two halves make up a whole.
they do,
And if
yeah.
if you have an egg and you break the egg in two, each egg half the egg would be different. You wouldn't, if they were both the same, if they broke apart and they were both broke apart the same, they wouldn't fit together. They would not fit together. But because you broke the same egg apart and then you try to fit together, they do fit together because they're not exactly the same. Does that
Okay.
make sense?
It makes some sense, sure. Yeah,
You have to break something else, something that you could actually work without it spilling all over the floor. So, yeah. We are so different, and we don't know how to fit together sometimes.
yeah.
And so that's part of the puzzle mystery of the marriage.
Yeah.
Hallelujah. So yeah, when each is doing their part, it's like the body of Messiah. When each is doing its part, then the whole is benefited. The relationship, the family is benefited when each does their part. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated his own body, but feeds and cares for it just as Messiah does the assembly. For we are members of his body. And there's that body metaphor again, broken down and interpreted in light of the family structure. And then he quotes Genesis, "For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh." And he's quoting this because this is what was established in the beginning, is this relationship between a man and a woman being mutually beneficial. And it's not a dominant
Yeah,
relationship.
yeah.
It's a relationship where both,
Yeah,
when they do their part, then they both benefit.
yeah.
So this is a profound mystery. He says, I'm talking about Messiah in the assembly. So the picture of Messiah in the assembly is a profound mystery. It's a picture of something else. It's a picture of the relationship between Elohim and his people, but it's also a picture of our interrelationships, especially in this case, between a husband and the wife. Each one of you must also love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect or fear her husband. And in here, where it says the wife must respect, it's actually the word for fear. And here, it's properly translated respect, but it has that element of fear. Because we've talked about this in our relationship with Elohim. Should we fear him or should we respect him? Well, it's kind of a little bit of both. We should fear him for who he is and what he's capable of doing. But that fear is kind of tamped down by love, the love in that relationship. And so we don't have to be afraid of Elohim like the disobedient and rebellious ones need to be afraid, because we've made it right with him. And so the fear or respect or honor that we pay Elohim is kind of balanced out by that love relationship and the fact that we are part of his and that he receives us. So we don't have to have fear of judgment, but there still needs to be an honor and respect for who he is. And so it is with a wife with her husband. She is to respect. If she feels loved by her husband, she's not going to fear abuses. Because if the husband understands his role, he's not going to abuse his wife in any way, physically, spiritually, mentally, or any of those things. But he's going to love her, and she can respect him for that. Men need to heed this instruction. I kind of already talked about this slide. Men are the head, not the owner. Love is expressed through servanthood and self-sacrifice. Men, domination has no place in marriage. A wise man will listen to his wife's giftings. Instructions for children. Children, obey your parents in Yahweh, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. Are there any children in the room? Perk up your ears. This is for you. Listen up. All right. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise. You know, the honor your father and mother is in the 10 Commandments. It's the 5th one. And it says that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. If you honor your father and mother, you will enjoy long life. This is what Yahweh has promised. You have to honor them and obey them. Fathers, I have a word for fathers here. Do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of Yahweh. Fathers, we failed again in this thing. We often exasperate our children. Exasperate comes from the word par or gidzo. Or gidzo is the word that means wrath or anger. Par or gidzo is a preposition enhancing this idea of provoking somebody to wrath. And here's 3 ways that, there are probably a lot of other ways, but for fathers, these are 3 things you do which exasperate or provoke your children to anger, and you're commanded not to do this. Using sarcasm. I have to hold both hands up on this one because I've been so guilty of sarcasm. And, you know, from the days before I was walking with the Lord, and it carried through for a long time after I was walking with the Lord, I was very sarcastic about everything. And I know that's...
Me too.
You too. Some of us may be. I think men especially, but women can be sarcastic too. Harsh or bitter derision or irony. A sharply ironical taunt. Sneering or cutting remarks. Sarcasm cuts at people. And when we use sarcasm with one another, we're wounding one another.
Yeah.
But especially with our tender children. Using sarcasm on our children, again, I'm guilty, but I'm confessing it. And I think there was a point in time when I realized it and began to turn away from it. That those taunts, that, we make fun of our children when they say something odd or, that's not right on the point, or the things they say or do, and we taunt them and we sneer at them with using sarcasm. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a point in time when the children are angered by that. Mm-hmm. You can't help when you cut somebody down or you make fun of them all the time.
Especially a parent.
Especially a parent, yeah, the one that is supposed to be loving you and nurturing you. When a parent uses sarcasm, a point in time comes when the children are angered, and then they put up their defenses and they won't listen any longer because you're hurting them. We need to just cut out the sarcasm from our vocabulary, especially, well, all the time, but especially with our children. Long lectures. I received long lectures from my stepfather when I lived in his home. And long lectures just going on and on about a matter, and just, if we as fathers are trying to correct our children, we need to correct them and then let it go and give them an opportunity to change. But if we continue on and on and on and lecture and lecture and lecture, I remember when my stepfather lectured me, I would turn off, I'd be thinking about anything and everything else as he continued to rattle on about this. I mean, he would just go like a half hour or an hour. He'd lecture me about whatever this thing that I had done, And it's like, this is another way that we exasperate our children. We need to cut that out too. We need to be careful that when we're trying to discipline and correct our children, that we don't overdo it, that the error that we're trying to correct, we make a bigger thing out of it than it is. And this is my third point: inconsistency in discipline. Is, sometimes we'll call out our child on something, and then the next time he does it, we just kind of like turn our head and ignore it because we're tired of trying to correct that thing, and so we allow it. And then the child then gets to the point where they don't know whether
Mixed signals?
what we say, the mixed signal, what we say we really believe. Because at one time we see them do it and allow them to do it, and another time we see them do it and then we call them out on it and correct them and give long lectures and use sarcasm on our children. And so these are just three ways that we fathers need to check our own behavior and the way that we're raising our children. Because the way we do it, and not just the fact that we do it, but the way we do it can have negative effects and consequences on our children.
I was just gonna say, we've done all those things and had to correct them the best we can. And they all, I can see all of those as part of our parenting,
Yeah,
you know, discipline as we got older to learn.
yeah. So if we want our children to really learn and to grow from our corrective comments and our disciplines, they need to be reasonable. They need to be not beyond what our child can handle. And we, as the parents, as the fathers, need to recognize what's too much, when we're being too harsh, when we're going on around, when we're cutting them down and not building them up. And so this is all a part of the instruction not to exasperate your children.
Well, you got that as a child from your father, your stepfather.
Yeah,
So
Yeah,
that's what you did to your children.
everybody,
yeah,
everybody carry that
And come
bad
around.
tradition.
yeah, that's true. Yeah, but, I don't know, I think I got sarcasm from just hardening my heart too. Not just from the way that my father treated me, but trying to get along with my peers. So you have to have in order to get along with people that are harsh and critical and
Yeah.
you kind of have to harden yourself a little bit and do the same thing. You got to fight back.
Yeah.
Fire with fire kind of thing. And I learned some of that sarcasm that I carried with me for a long time from my peers and trying to cope with or get along with my peers. So yeah, I'm not blaming my stepfather for everything. There are a lot of inputs into my life that caused me to take a wrong course of action and to carry that out on the children. Slaves, this is pretty straightforward. I'm gonna, what time is it? I'm gonna kind of skip over this because we're already gone long. Slaves and masters, the teaching's the same. Slaves should obey their masters as unto the Lord. Doing the will of Elohim, we should regard those relationships as being like, I'm not just serving a human being, I'm serving, this is my lot for right now in life, to be a servant to somebody. And servanthood isn't necessarily a bad thing. I know slavery, historically speaking, has been bad and ugly and awful. But slavery in the scriptures is about somebody offering themselves as a slave to somebody that can provide the needs.